Well, hello everyone. Really good to be with you, albeit virtually, and many thanks for watching this short video. My name's Simon Sleight, and I'm reader in urban history, historical youth cultures, and Australian history at King's College London. And I'm delighted to get this panel on rethinking agency, experience, contextuality, and relationality underway. The panel was first conceived at the SHCY gathering in Sydney in 2019, prior to what I'm calling the Great Separation. Since then, two of our keywords, agency and experience, have been picked up and pondered in a roundtable at the Hex Centre in Finland. Here's a link to the recorded debate, out of which grew a reading list kindly initiated by Stephanie Olsen. And here's that on screen now. I've also been burnishing my ideas for the purposes of the more recent online discussion with Alistair Owens at Queen Mary's Centre for Childhood Cultures. And by the time you see this recording, that talk and the lively Q&A that followed will also hopefully be available. Today, I'll be taking things further once more. So far as experience goes, I also have form, if that's the right term, going back to 2011, when I first spoke on what I termed the shift to experience at a gathering at Cambridge University, convened to reflect on the array of intellectual and educational contributions made by the late Colin Ward of Child in the City fame. That talk grew into a chapter, which I've highlighted here, and I shall circle back to some of the ideas advanced there later on today. I've subtitled my talk for you Deeds and Words, because I regard both as crucial in understanding the histories of childhood and youth. Words are what we engage with as historians in order to get to deeds, and deeds sponsor the sorts of words that we find in our historical sources. So there's a dialectic. And while the realities of young people's past lives should not be confused with the words that describe those realities, it's important, in my view, to both understand the mediating and shaping role of language and the primacy of our quest to understand historical activities. For me, this is why social and socio-cultural approaches to history often trump purely cultural or intellectual approaches. The very best works of history, I would maintain, tell us more about actions than representations. And this is why a consideration of the relative potentialities of agency and experience is so pressing. As many viewers will know, and as I noted in my original abstract for this paper, agency as a concept for understanding youth in the past has come in for sustained critique in recent years. Researchers on childhood and youth have spoken against agency, sought to undercut the epistemological and archive-based assumptions of the idea, and cautioned unwary scholars against tumbling into a purported agency trap. At a conference gathering on the theme of speaking up and speaking out, a reconsideration of the idea of agency seems especially compelling. Commencing then with a delineation and an evaluation of the main points of contention about historical agency, this paper calls for a taking stock and a sideways step. Its chief purpose is not to defend agency, though a case could certainly be mounted using sharpened analytical tools and by drawing more widely than hitherto on the insights of half a century of social history, as well as studies from other disciplines. Instead, however, I argue for the idea of experience to have its day. Experience is a blood relation of agency, but more open in outlook. With experience, there are fewer concerns about an imbalanced focus on youthful, politicized, or otherwise spectacular activity in the past, or confusions about youthful self-expression as an all or nothing act. Instead, I will propose a focus on youthful experience allows for modes of self-presentation to be better understood, and for the rhythms of youthful everyday life in the past to be recaptured and assessed in capacious ways. In support of my arguments, I will range widely in deploying both scholars and sources, and I had hoped, as pitched in my original abstract, to illuminate my arguments with reference to a range of photographic evidence depicting children and youth in the past. Things have changed a little since penning that abstract for all of us, and so the promised consideration of historical photographs of young people will have to wait. That's proved impossible due to the closure of the Liverpool Record Office. And also, my thinking has developed in new directions since I've penned that abstract, and I've continued to read widely within this area and indeed beyond the discipline of history. So here's then what I have for you today, how I will structure the remainder of my talk, essentially moving through the agency debate in various ways and on to consider the category of experience. So let's first consider the case against agency. And here on screen, I have summarized the main points on a charge sheet, if you will. Now, such a list as this represents the fruits of considered thinking on the part of historians, including Mona Gleeson and others, and there is clearly a case to answer here. Many of the criticisms noted can be encapsulated in an image of how youth cultures used to look to those who studied them: assertive and often showy, ideally politically engaged and protesting against the establishment, as well as all too often Western, white, and with girls present in the background where present at all. Linking to that background status of girls in the image, important contributions to critiques of agency have been made by girls' studies scholars and by historians of women. Here's a flyer for a 2020 event posing some thorny and apt questions about agency, including such issues as who is speaking and who gets to determine who is agentic. And here on screen now is the cover of a key book on enslaved women, a study of Bridgetown in the Caribbean, in which the limits of agency as a concept are made very plain for the book's subjects, women whose lives and indeed afterlives were constrained so tightly by the violence of the system in which they found themselves. Coupled with such critiques, historians of emotion, including Karen Valgada, have also pronounced in strong terms against agency as a lens or method for understanding the past. Now, these criticisms are part of a lively and ongoing discussion among scholars of childhood and youth, and in calling attention to agency and its purported shortcomings, these scholars have really done a lot to help sharpen our thinking. But, as I will maintain, there are also dangers associated with the agency debate. We're at potential risk, I think, of churning round and round without really moving forward. Hence my visual analogy here of the eddy. That analogy also works in another way too, because it calls attention to how, in so many other fields, scholars are continuing to work with, push, and stretch the concept of agency in new ways, leaving historians of childhood and youth at risk of becoming sidelined unless they make a concerted effort to escape the vortex. So here are some examples on the screen now of recent works from beyond the field of childhood and youth, which applies ideas of agency in places we might well consider on first sight as offering very limited potential for the concept, namely agency as associated with objects, animals, and those who have passed away. Some of this work comes from beyond the discipline of history, it should be noted, but just as there can be eddies in streams, so too there are tributaries of river systems, and very few scholars swim in only one set of waters. There are also recent and fairly recent book and article contributions on agency which address our principal concerns of children, childhood and youth. And once again, those publications noted on screen come from across different disciplines, including history. It's worth reflecting at this juncture too, that even in some of the most searching critiques of agency, including this one by David Lancy, who offers through his writing the departure point for Mona Gleeson's journal article, with which so many of you will be familiar, that even here, the critics propose a reframing of agency rather than a wholesale abandonment. This point can be forgotten where scholars generalize about the problem with agency, or when students think that it's now no longer possible to perceive children as social actors in the past. And it's worth pointing out too that quite a few earlier contributions to the debate, contributions mostly from outside the field of history, in fact offer potential answers to some of the questions later posed by historians. Here's an example on screen, an engaging piece by Kylie Valentine, and one which we might read alongside the monographs and edited collections from my earlier slide. Agency, it transpires, can be more generous as a term than its sharpest critics admit. And babies, perhaps then, don't necessarily need to be thrown out alongside bathwater. If you'll allow me to push the liquid analogy for just a moment or two more, running parallel to that veritable river of writings on agency, and sometimes intersecting with that flow, scholars are also exhibiting, lately especially, a greater appreciation of what I've termed a shift to experience, lighting on a term which, like agency, allows us to discern activities, albeit in more expansive and, I would say, less problematic ways. But what does experience really mean? And how might it better help us understand the histories of childhood and youth? Well, for me, experience is the feel and the fabric of everyday life, the texture of the past that resides in between context, as defined by Quentin Skinner, and text, following Roland Barthes. This texture, as I wrote in a 2016 chapter, is the felt experience of life. And it's something that we can seek to recover and analyse through drawing on a wide array of source types. Let's work through some other definitions of experience to try and take things further. Here's an engaging definition from the poet and Buddhist priest, Norman Fisher. And you might like to pause the audio at this point and pause the video too to read along. And the same will hold true for my next two slides. Now, as we can see here, Fisher's description captures the temporal, subjective, and sensory nature of the phenomenon. And some of what is here presupposes the emotional turn within scholarship. And I also like the grounded nature, the spatial basis, if you will, of what's being proposed. There's no need to be agentic, furthermore, to have experiences such as those noted in the quotation here. Next, we have a definition from the Chinese-American geographer Yi-Fu Tuan. Pause again, if you like, at this point. Once more, there's an emphasis on the sensory here, as well as a holistic interest in ways of being in the world. This one was published, as you can see, back in 1977. And here, definitely requiring pause for thought, is an explanation from the always handy keyword series. And I invite you to read that now as well. The elaboration that you can see on screen, the one that's taken from the keyword series, is especially interesting for our purposes today, given how much of the discussion in the left-hand column pertains to youth, as well with regard to the tangles of language and power that are assessed in the right-hand column. And the challenge of language is something that has been picked up in this really fun book produced by the MIT Press, and one which came to me via the 2019 retrospective on artist Olafur Eliasson at London's Tate Modern. Designed as an experience in and of itself, the book's cover is heat sensitive, its pages are covered in pheromones, would you believe, and the spidery bookmarks rather wonderfully reflect the simultaneous holding of multiple reading interests. The book's contents include a reprint of the essay mentioned in the keywords entry, namely the piece on historicizing experience by Joan Scott, which is listed under section 5 there in the table of contents. Now, for those that don't know it, this piece sees Scott cast a very gloomy postmodernist perspective on our chances of ever recovering experience. Experience for Scott is merely a linguistic event, and all that can really be studied is language rather than actual activity. Now, I'm a fan of Scott, but I would say that she's very far wrong here, in my view. And I was delighted to see this essay further challenged in a recent book by Rob Boddice and Mark Smith, a Cambridge Elements volume titled Emotion, Sense, Experience. And that work defines experience as, and I quote, the ways in which living was real in historical terms. And I entirely agree. So as well as thinking with experience for all historical actors, including young people, it might be worth thinking with and through a spin-off category. And so I'd like us to think about the notion of formative experiences now. And these are rites of passage and everyday actions that pertain especially strongly to youth as a stage of life. I don't think it's a coincidence that the three texts on screen, two are books and one is a film, pair youth and experience so explicitly. And it's also clear that addressing once again the possibilities and pitfalls of memory as a source will be a key component in any new histories of youthful experience. Now, some of you watching along might think there's an air of Back to the Future with regard to some of what I've been saying. Here's a film poster and the famous time clock from the film series. Now, in that, you'd be right, because as scholars such as Roger Hart, Colin Ward, and the already mentioned Yi-Fu Tuan have long been saying, at least since the 1970s, experience is a key conduit for historical understanding, including of youth. And as I also said in my Queen Mary discussion, I wonder too what Marc Bloch, Fernand Braudel, and other scholars of the early 20th century would have made of this discussion too, this potential shift to experience, or indeed the social historians of the 1960s. So there may then be lots to rediscover. Here are some more classic works on screen which pick up on notions of experience, as well as new ground to explore in any return to the category of experience. And so to finish, by thinking with experience now, perhaps we can escape the eddy of agency. Building into earlier discussions and accounts of experience, a greater appreciation of the intersectional, the sensory, the embodied, and the emotional, as well, I would strongly advocate as retaining a focus on the spatial dimensions of life, experience would seem to me to offer a fruitful way ahead. And all that remains is to thank you for watching. I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts in the live discussion that we'll be having later. And I also welcome any follow-up correspondence. Take care, everyone. Keep going. And I hope very much to see you all again in person soon.